So let's get things underway. And apologies to everyone on the recording and online and here for the slightly delayed start to this. It's a long story of bad weather in Papua New Guinea and Zoom links gone missing and various other things. So there is a new Zoom link for people to latch onto. Anyway, we are lucky to have Carmel O'Shannessy, who is an active member from CAS, here to talk to us today about adults, children, and how languages diversify, which is absolutely central to the project of ECTI, the case study of Light Warlpiri, an Australian mixed language. I'm not going to introduce Carmel because she is part of us, so I will leave it to her to tell us about and work through her talk. Carmel.
Thank you very much, Chris. And hello, everybody. And yes, apologies for the delay. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, work and study, and also the lands of the languages that we're going to be talking about today, and of everyone participating. But firstly, I'm going to talk to you about research that I've been working on now for a long time and have many people in Lajimanu to thank. All of these people and more have contributed in one way or another over the last 20 years or so to my being able to take these perspectives on a new language emerging in the community. So a mixed language, which doesn't sound like a technical term, but it is an unusual outcome of language contact processes. And because it's unusual, it raises questions about the processes of language and cognition involved, because we have a new way of speaking that comes to be everybody's way of speaking as they grow up, and that's different from previous generations. So how does this happen? For example, we can ask, are the processes involved in an unusual outcome different from processes that we see everywhere else qualitatively? Or is it that there's something like the processes themselves are actually not that different if you look at each process involved, but the combination of sociolinguistic circumstances and cognitive factors leads to a different outcome, which kind of touches on what you were talking about, Laura, recently, about kind of the cultural and social considerations in language contact and change. And what does understanding more about one situation like this add to our understanding of how linguistic diversity develops? One particular question is that, what are the roles of different age groups? I mean, most documentation is of adult speech, so we don't usually even ask about the roles of different age groups. Of course, there's documentation of child language acquisition, but it's not usually looking at these kinds of situations. So the two are usually fairly separate. So can we find out more about the actual processes involved in contact-induced language change from a situation like this? So there's a little bit of geography needed because it's relevant to the emergence of the new way of speaking, the new language. So Lajimanu community is fairly remote. The Warlpiri area is this sort of area in general, and you can see in the red circle down the bottom 3 Warlpiri communities that were created after colonisation around the 1930s. And then you can see that Lajimanu is fairly north of those. That's because that community was established by involuntary relocation of people from the communities further south by the government in 1948, 1949. And that basically people were loaded onto trucks, taken up there, unloaded and told, you know, you live here now. And over time, they established the community. They literally built it. They built the houses, you know, with their own hands. They built the fences and the roads with their own hands and picks and shovels over that time. And now, you know, it's an established community. So if you can see the dotted line of the roads there, that road between Lajamanu and the other communities is not a sealed road, it's gravel and sand. And Lajamanu is right on the edge between the monsoon area, the tropical monsoon area, and the desert area. So Lajamanu has a wet season and a dry season. So those roads are then not able to be travelled on for 4 or 5 months of the year, maybe 6 months of the year. So you can see that it's a really long way otherwise if you can't travel up and down, that road. And of course now everybody has a mobile phone, but that was not the case. When I went there in 1998, pretty much nobody had a phone in their own house, for example. So the isolation, I'm not saying that people were isolated. People always keep in touch and they always travel for community events, family events, funerals, sports, things like that. But nevertheless, there's an element of isolation there from the other communities. And the road north to Katherine, which is the nearest town, is mostly a sealed road. So people would travel north up to the Katherine area for things like hospitals, health, administration, that kind of thing. And that's in a Kriol speaking area. So a Kriol is itself a contact language of a different kind that's spoken right across the north of Australia. And so people had more contact with other Indigenous people speaking Kriol and slightly less contact with Warlpiri speakers. So I went to the community in 1998 and my job was to support the Warlpiri teachers to teach Warlpiri to their kids in the school. And while I was doing that, I started to hear people sort of mixing languages, code switching. And I thought that was pretty interesting, but I also thought, oh, that's sort of just now. They're just mixing their languages just now. And then after a while, I sort of started to listen closely and I realised that I was listening to these kids using both languages in every sentence, bang, 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 bang. And that's unusual because while code switching, which is moving from one language to another, is very patterned, you wouldn't normally expect it to be quite that patterned. You'd expect a longer stretch of this language, that kind of thing. So I asked the community members if they would be interested in me looking into this a little bit more, to have a kind of a snapshot of the language situation in the community, maybe with a view to making decisions about the school programs. And they agreed. And so that became my PhD research. And I've continued working on this ever since. So the data I'm drawing on are things like kids playing with each other, adults talking to kids. So why kids? Well, it seemed like there might be something interesting going on there. And also there's very little language acquisition work in First Nations languages of Australia. So it was an acquisition project and it seemed like a way to find out how young people speak would be to see young parents and children interacting. So they kind of combined. People telling stories from picture books, which gives you something to talk about and also makes the data very comparable because everyone's, in a sense, telling the same story, but there are no words written, right? So they're also just telling their own story as much as they want to. So they're the main types of data that I'm drawing on. So it turned out that people who are now over the age of about 40 speak Warlpiri most of the time, but they also speak other languages and they code switch between Warlpiri and English and the Kriol that I mentioned. Whereas people younger than that age, adults and children, speak the new way of speaking most of the time as their main primary language. They also speak Warlpiri. They also speak English and they can also speak other languages and a little bit of Kriol, but they don't speak Kriol, but they know about Kriol. So it's a very multilingual and complex situation. So we want to know what the linguistic components are that went into the new mixed language. So this is what Warlpiri sounds like. Oh. Oh, how am I going to? Okay. Maybe I won't. Okay. So, Puru wajili pungu kurunguju janduju mula kango kurkungu. Apologies to all of the speakers who I won't actually now play a recording of. What you can see there, I hope, from all the little hyphens is that there are a lot of suffixes in this language. So it's a Parmanuan language, which is a suffixing language. And I put a circle there around a morpheme, which is a morpheme that tells you who the agent of an action is. An ergative case mark, it's called. This is important because it's very different from the English way of structuring a sentence. And you can see there, it's the monster who's doing something, and that word is at the end. So we've got different word order, a different structure, suffixing, and case marking. Kriol is quite different, more isolating, so much less suffixing, separate words, more often word order like English, SVO, and I've circled there a couple of words, bin, which is a past tense marker, which ultimately comes from English, but is now like a Kriol structure, and haben, which is have with a transitive marker on it. So I've got Dijam baby bin haben one puppy dog, and even play garum him. So they're factors that are going to be relevant coming into Light Warlpiri. So how do these come together in Light Warlpiri? So the Warlpiri is in blue and italics, and the English or Kriol is in the reddy browny colour. And in general, I'm usually not trying to distinguish between English or Kriol because there's a lot of overlap. So for example, the word come, you can't say if that's from English or Kriol, really. Okay. Car, for example. So what we see is that the suffixing structure of Warlpiri with word endings is retained, and a lot of Warlpiri words. And verbs often come from English and Kriol. So come, go, intransitive verbs. But then in number 3, bottling in bandinum tire, we've got a Warlpiri verb, but we've got the which is the same from habum, from Kriol, on it. So we've got, for verbs, we've got a Kriol structure where intransitive verbs aren't marked, like come and go, but transitive verbs, where there's an action transferred onto another entity, have this transitive marker that comes from Kriol. But we also see that the morpheme that shows who's doing an action from Warlpiri is retained as well. So we've got bottling, because it's the bottle doing it, in bandinum tire. And then the ones in green are a new structure that's come into this language that we can trace from the sources, Warlpiri and English and Kriol. But once it comes into Light Warlpiri, it's a new structure that's not the same as in its source languages. So we'll look at those. So one of the processes that's happened within Kriol is some contraction. So there's a Kriol future or deciderative morpheme like I'm going to, gutta or gutta, which ultimately comes from English, I've got to, I've gotta, you say it quickly, becomes gutta, grammaticalized, and then you drop off the first sound gut and you get utta. And that's in Kriol and Light Warlpiri. From wanna, you go to ana, drop off the first consonant. And then from that bin past that I pointed out, and also from English I'm, which is present, if you say been really quickly and you kind of lose the b, you end up with And then we've got, in English, we've got a pronoun and we've got the element, which is an auxiliary. And so in Light Warlpiri, we get And then from im and dem, which are pronouns in Kriol, from him and them, third singular and third plural, if we generalize that structure, we end up with a pronoun and a pronoun and So im and dem, instead of just being pronouns, are a pronoun plus a structure for time. And what's interesting about these is that they divide the kind of categories into non-future versus future. So things that haven't, whereas in Warlpiri, it's past and non-past. But Mary has shown that that actually maps onto a Warlpiri semantic difference. So it's not entirely different from Warlpiri, but it is a bit. So if we look at this paradigm of these new forms, the two bottom rows, it turned out, were already part of Kriol, but the top row isn't and wasn't. And what we can see is that separation of the forms im, and dem has been generalised across to forms that don't exist in Kriol or English, yum and wim. So once we get that morpheme on yum and wim, then it's really clear that that is a new structure itself. It's not just a pronoun anymore. And then what we can see here is a really regular structure across all of these forms. So we've gone from we bin come, for example, in Kriol, to wim come, meaning present or past, not only meaning past. So that's a bit different. So there are not many.
Yeah, it keeps on muting.
There are not many languages in the world with this kind of what we call verb-noun structural split. Called that because the verbs are largely from Kriol, or the structure is largely from Kriol, but the noun structure is largely from Warlpiri. Michif, spoken in north of the US and into Canada, is a combination of Cree verbal structure and French nouns. So that's one that's a bit similar. And in a community that neighbours Lajimonu, Gurindji Kriol is a combination of Gurindji noun structure and Kriol verb structure in a very similar way to Light Warlpiri, but not exactly the same. It also is the case that across Central Australia, where new varieties are emerging that are not mixed languages, but they show some features of them in that if these are sort of varieties of Kriol, but if they have morphology from the traditional language, that morphology will be noun morphology. So Sally Dixon has shown that in a recent paper, kind of outlining a lot of those languages, including work in Tennant Creek by Samantha Disbray. And not the same kind of split, but for example, Nick documented borrowing of a verb paradigm in an article completely in much further north in North Australia, which just shows that each of these processes is not that uncommon. You know, none of them is unique, but they're not that common either. Now, how did the language come about? Well, it's widely accepted that mixed languages are created by bilinguals, and the evidence for that is that the grammar of both languages largely comes into the new language fairly intact. And it's sort of hypothesized that you must already know enough of your language to bring the two languages together in a fairly intact way. So did adults do this? What roles did the different age groups play? So I was interested in this for a couple of reasons, and one is that it's an unresolved question. We do know that adult code switching is common, like I was hearing at the beginning. And so a little detour to what we see in bilingual language acquisition anyway, like what do young children do when they're learning more than one language? They do show language mixing when they're young. And they can even show the kind of mixing that we see in Light Warlpiri, where you have the word from one language and a grammatical morpheme for the other. But they generally conform to the target community way of speaking as they grow older. And we also know that despite the fact that children can mix languages and do mix languages when they're very young, they also can differentiate the languages from very early on. Should I stop for a sec? Or
I think you can boot people. I'm just going to have to boot me. Yeah. That's right. Let's try and turn the Zoom.
So there's different types of evidence that shows that although children mix parts of both languages that they're still learning, they do at different levels know that they're different systems and use them differently. Then as bilinguals grow up, they can show transfer from one language to another and develop new patterns, reanalyzing what they're hearing. Adult bilinguals can be like a first language, monolingual first language speaker in each language. They can also be, like a monolingual language speaker, but with some transfer from the other language. There's a lot of sort of variations there. So if people are receiving code switched input as a child, usually that doesn't mean they grow up speaking a mixed language. They can still grow up speaking separate languages if that's important in their community and if that's what the target community is. Oh dear. Is there anything else to do or?
Not really. They seemed, I think their laptop was hijacked.
Yeah, I think
It's
so.
on all the screens now. I removed them.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Great.
They must have had the rights to do the same thing.
Okay, so bilingual children know that there are two linguistic systems. Okay. Now, also something that happens in first language acquisition is that children are figuring out how the language works, obviously. So when they say cute things, what they're really doing is showing their hypothesis for what they're figuring out at that moment, okay? So for example, on analogy of sing, sang, they might say bring, brang for a while before they then change back to what the community target is, or, bring, bringed, because past tense has the ed, or something like nail polish me, because polish is a verb, nail polish is a noun. So they're figuring it out, right? And kids tend to, they look for patterns, they regularize, like what we just saw there were regularizations, and they're trying to find the patterns in how people are speaking to them. Now, one time I was with some young family members who were about 3 or 4 years old, and I heard them saying things like, Anna do it, or Anna get it. Oh, Light Warlpiri, Anna, fantastic, that's interesting. So maybe English-speaking kids go from Wana to Anna as part of their development, anyway. So we searched through, a couple of students and I searched through many files in the child is language acquisition corpus, looking for if this has happened and is documented in the corpus. And it is, we found it. So in this part of the corpus from Providence, is Catherine DeMuth's corpus, actually, we found a child saying, Anna, hold it up. And it was transcribed in International Phonetic Alphabet as Anna. So it wasn't just my biased ears hearing Anna, but then the English transcription of it had wanna, I wanna hold it up. So it seems that part of what English-speaking children do is they contract that down to Anna for a while when they're 3 or 4, and then they go back to I wanna later on. I'll read that out now. And this is what usually happens, right? Kids have these cute differences of where they're forming their hypothesis for how the language works, and then they realise that's not how everybody says it, and they go to the target way. Okay, so now we know that background. We come back to this case study, and after people were relocated to the community, adults were working on cattle stations and in army camps with other Indigenous people speaking all different kinds of languages, and they needed a common way to communicate. And there wasn't the Kriol language that I've talked about was emerging at that time, and so people used that to communicate. And so I think what happened was they then also code switched between Warlpiri and Kriol very frequently, and I think especially when they were speaking to young children, in what's called a baby talk register. So Mary has documented a baby talk register for Warlpiri. We have one for English too, you know, where we change the way we're speaking when we're speaking to very little kids. The Warlpiri one has some specific features of it, but I think what happened in this community, that as part of the way of speaking to very young children, adults were code switching between Warlpiri and Kriol. So they'd have a string of Warlpiri and they'd have this Kriol in it. So for example, this is from a speaker who's older than the Light Warlpiri cohort of speakers. And she said, Nyambulana, grow up, Jadija, Abin kam widangana jangaju TC janga. So you can see there's a Kriol bit and there's a Warlpiri bit. And then this recording is also from someone who's older than the Light Warlpiri cohort of speakers, and he's speaking here to a 2-year-old child. So you can see lots of Warlpiri. You can see some bits of Kriol in bindem, de bindem, dem findem for found. And the blue that's bold is the verb. So there are Warlpiri verbs, but there's also this pattern in bindem, de bindem, with no past tense been, right? But it's got the Kriol structure of the transitive marker im on the verb. So I think that kids were hearing very consistently and frequently this kind of structure. Warlpiri, 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 pronoun and verb from Kriol. Warlpiri, Warlpiri, Warlpiri. It's also the case, Mary and Velma Leading documented kids in the 1970s, teenagers, sort of secondary school age kids, switching between Warlpiri and English as well. So kids may have also been getting this kind of pattern from their sort of older peers, as well as from their parent generation. So I think that bin was probably variable. They probably heard some sentences with it and some sentences without it. So they're hearing something like this: im bindem, dem get 'em, im laughing, im going, and they're looking for the patterns, right? So they find the patterns. That's the pattern. And then they realise, you know, you use it this way when something's already happened, and you use it this way when something's happening now. So they've got their pattern, so then they make use of the pattern and regularise it across the other parts of the structure that weren't in the input to them. So from the child learner perspective, this is actually a very small step. You know, it's just an incremental change. But of course, it's quite a big change in the structure of the whole language. So once you do all that, you put all that together, and then you get something like Nganimbang Wimgo, look round, Warlpiri, Bosawarapik, Numeraik. So you've still got the Warlpiri noun structure. You've got that little ergative suffix that shows who's doing an action, and you've got the Kriol verb structure, and you've got this new construction, which is the So why do I think children were involved in this? Well, remember we went from wana to ana, and, you know, this is something that English speakers do when they're 3 or 4, maybe not every child, but some kids. I actually heard a kid say it last week, who was about 4 and used this ana construction. So I think the kids at that age did that. And it stayed, like that's a construction in Light Warlpiri. So for example, Anagetum baby we first kapangu. So if we take that as like an analogy that we've got evidence for, we can think of, well, in English, kids use it for a while and then they change back and it doesn't stay. Like we know that that has not stayed in English. Well, as far as we know. But in Light Warlpiri, it stayed. And all the kids started using it, and it became part of the language. And on analogy, we can think, well, the same kind of thing would have happened with the and then it got regularized, and then we've got you and wim. And again, it stayed. And part of the reason it stayed is probably because it's a really nice regular paradigm, which is part of a larger paradigm, not completely regular, but fairly regular, the parts in green are the parts that are unique to Light Warlpiri. Another influence would have been that in Warlpiri you have a tense mood aspect morpheme and a pronoun together. They're in the opposite order, but there's still that pattern of, you know, these things go together as an auxiliary. So the cut is the tense part, and then the other part is the pronoun part. So then we would want to ask, well, if bilingual children know that their languages are separate, and you can grow up as a bilingual and speak each language separately, even though you code switch, why didn't that happen? Well, it did happen, because the input that the children were getting was Warlpiri from older speakers and a mixed system, this code switching system that was very consistent. So I think young children find patterns in what they hear. They might adjust them a bit to fit their own way of thinking, which is that reanalysis that we saw. Usually they adjust back, but in this situation, they didn't adjust back, and everybody started using it. So why would that have happened? So then we come to the sociolinguistic configuration, because all of the processes that we've seen till now are all processes that can happen in languages in the world, right? But they don't all lead to a new mixed language. In fact, you know, that hardly ever happens. So I think it's for sociolinguistic reasons that it then caught on. So these people are living in, you know, a small remote community. There's in general pressure to speak English, you know, from the wider administration. They're interacting a lot with people who speak Creole. So there, I don't mean pressure in a bad way. I just mean you're getting a lot of social interaction and you're hearing Creole a lot. You know, they're separate to some extent from the other Warlpiri communities. It's not that easy to interact with those, although they still do. Also, I observed, and other people have documented, children have a lot of individual autonomy when they're growing up. It's safe, there's a lot of freedom. They hang out with other children a lot, you know, almost all the time. Maybe they modelled themselves on the other children, you know, accommodate to them in their speech. There's also a lot of creativity in Warlpiri. There are things, there are culturally patterned ways of bringing in words from other languages. So, for example, after a death, certain words become taboo, and one way of handling that is to bring in other words, potentially from other languages. People speak different varieties and styles. There are different genres to do with, for example, politeness, different ways of addressing people. So there is a lot of variation. There was multilingualism anyway from the inputs they're getting. It's a small bounded community. And also these changes that they made from the child learner perspective are very small changes. They just got the input and regularized it a bit. But of course it had a big impact across the overall grammatical system. So the adults were talking the way that they always do, in this baby talk style to young children, using more than one language in a sentence and in a very consistent pattern. The children did what they always do. They looked for the patterns, they found them, they reanalyzed them a bit, and they regularized them a bit, creating a new structure. And then because of the specific sociolinguistics configuration, it caught on and stayed in their way of speaking. And I think part of that too was, once it was sort of part of their way of speaking, they realized that and thought, this is our way of speaking. And, you know, they like it and they keep it. We're now in the third generation of Light Warlpiri speakers. You know, it's very much their own way of speaking. Although there's not that much consensus about the roles of different children, child speakers and adult speakers in contact-induced language change, children have been seen to lead language change in a few different related scenarios, like koines, where there are different dialects coming together, multi-ethnolex, which are in the large European cities due to language contact, Nicaraguan Sign Language, for example. But importantly, it's not that the children are sort of doing some magic sort of along the lines of Bickerton's theory, where children kind of make up for the gaps in their language and bring something new in. They're very much just working on the language that they're getting in their input. So in several of these contact languages, people have documented children taking an incoming change and pushing it a little bit further. Or one way of putting it, the graph put it, children select some of the adults' innovations and bring them into their own way of speaking and make them available to future learners. So I would say not just make them available, but conventionalise them among their community of speakers. Patrick McConville, working on Australian contact languages as well, observed that the young children are also get linguistic input from older children, and this peer influence can be more important than that of the older generations. So they might deliberately choose to speak like the older kids and then build up their own language variety. So that seems very relevant here. I'm not sure how deliberately, maybe just through speech accommodation. You know, you do tend to speak like the way people are speaking to you. And also from their perspective, the input was not that different from what they ended up producing. So I mentioned this, I think this way of speaking then became part of their local identity, local young people from this community. It's not spoken so far in the other Warlpiri communities, it's only in Ludgermone. And I think it shows partial language maintenance, even though it shows language shift, because there's a lot of Warlpiri in Light Warlpiri, and the speakers really think of it as a type of Warlpiri. They call it Ludgermone style. So it's our style of Warlpiri. Although linguistically, because of that verb structure, you know, we can see that it's it could linguistically be called a separate language. So the process was children hearing input in a very consistent code switching pattern, identifying their own pattern, taking a little bit further. The new patterns catch on for sociolinguistic reasons, and now there's a new way of speaking. So I think this provides an empirically grounded model of a way of speaking can emerge and the roles of different age groups in that process. It shows the importance of social configurations of languages use. And I think it's interesting that all of the different elements grammatically all occur elsewhere in different kinds of situations, but they don't all lead to this result. And it's that sociolinguistic configuration that drives this result, along with, you know, the presence of those changes. So language diversification doesn't require a completely new set of drivers or processes, but it does require a specific configuration of them. So I suspect if we were able to look at child language more often in these complex multilingual situations, we might find something similar in the way that some new varieties or structures come about. Thank you, everybody.